Welcome to Planet America, coming to you from the Situation Room. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello, and yet again, we've got a situation.
The federal government follows through on its threat to withhold money from Harvard.
Harvard University is now suing the Trump administration.
Administration's attempts to freeze multiple billions of dollars are unconstitutional and illegal.
America's oldest and richest college digs in against Trump's anti-Semitism task force with billions of dollars on the line.
And the tricky edit that turned a short-term funding bill into something that holds for 400 years. But first...
President Trump has a battle on his hands after picking a fight with Harvard University over alleged anti-Semitism.
The administration ordering the school to report foreign students who commit conduct violations to federal authorities, submit to an audit to ensure academic departments have diverse viewpoints, and all DEI programs share hiring data with the administration, and submit to an audit of admissions data.
Unlike their counterparts at Columbia University, who made concessions, including new restrictions on demonstrations and a review of their Middle Eastern curriculum, Harvard said no to those demands, claiming most of the new requirements are about regulating intellectual conditions, not anti-Semitism.
Harvard's president wrote a letter in response saying the school, quote, will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights by agreeing to the terms.
And they got support from one prominent Harvard graduate.
Obama says Harvard has set an example for other higher ed institutions, rejecting an unlawful and ham-handed attempt to stifle academic freedom.
It might be a little rich coming from Obama, John, given that he and Biden also used funding threats against not just a small number of elite universities, but against virtually every college and university in America when they were enforcing their sexual misconduct policies. And by the way, at the time, that was also protested by 28 Harvard law professors. Now, Trump has pushed that tactic a lot further than Obama did, but still.
Interesting point. But then the Trump administration announced it would withhold more than $2 billion in federal funding from Harvard, which is a private institution ranked as the best global university by US News and World Report. Not the end of the world, perhaps. Harvard does enjoy the spoils of an endowment valued at in excess of $50 billion. But Trump's next threat turned up the pressure.
Perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired /supporting sickness. Remember, tax-exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the public interest.
And that's the point at which things got very confusing. According to the New York Times, an official on the Trump administration's anti-Semitism task force told the university that this letter of demands had actually been sent without authorization. While they said its content was authentic, some people at the White House believed that it had been sent prematurely. Others in the administration thought it was meant to be circulated among the task force members rather than being sent to Harvard. And then, in a classic bit of blame shifting, the White House claimed it was malpractice for Harvard's lawyers not to have picked up the phone to make sure the letter was really sent on purpose, accusing them instead of going on a victimhood campaign. But at the end of all of that, the federal funding remains frozen. Harvard is digging in, announcing yesterday they will sue the Trump administration over those frozen funds.
Look, this is going to be a critical battle for Harvard, John. They can handle $3 billion in lost funding because Trump has just threatened to cut another billion, so I just added that on. But losing their tax exemption would be disastrous because not only does the exemption save them heaps of money from tax, but it's also essential for fundraising because it allows donors to claim tax deductions as well. So politicising tax deductions, that would be a worrying step. Just ask old school J.D. Vance.
This is about whether we have functional constitutional government in this country. If the IRS can go after you because of what you think or what you believe or what you do, we'd no longer live in a free country. That's what this is all about. And if you think they're not going to eventually use it against your politics, whatever they might be, it's ridiculous. They certainly will.
Great point, old school JD. Now, to be fair, the White House is promising not to politicise this decision. A spokesperson stated that any forthcoming actions by the IRS will be conducted independently of the president. And such investigations were initiated prior to the president's tweet, they say. Maybe. But is this even legally possible? Because the federal tax code states that an organisation shall be exempt from taxation if it's organised exclusively for educational purposes, which Harvard obviously is. The administration apparently hopes to use a legal precedent set against Bob Jones University in the early 1980s when they were defunded for banning interracial dating. The Supreme Court held that to qualify for that tax exemption, a university must show that its activity is not contrary to settled public policy. Now, the administration presumably might try to argue that Harvard's alleged anti-Semitism is contrary to public policy. I reckon that's a tough push because Harvard has been addressing the anti-Semitism issue and it would be inconsistent with a number of recent Supreme Court decisions anyway. But we'll see about that. That's not even the biggest threat against Harvard, though. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has apparently sent Harvard a scathing letter demanding detailed records on Harvard's foreign student visa holders' alleged illegal and violent activities, or they could face the immediate loss of student and exchange visitor program certification. The letter went on to say it's a privilege to have foreign students attend Harvard University, not a guarantee. Now, let's just put that in context. Roughly 27% of Harvard's total enrolment this year came from foreign students, and I might add, the most profitable 27% as well. So, if they're coming after the foreign students, they're really tightening the screws on Harvard here, John, and in a way that some might suggest is less about anti-Semitism and more about leveraging government power to undermine the left.
Some might suggest that, Chaz. For more, we're joined by Cornell William Brooks, Professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a civil rights attorney and a former president of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. Professor Brooks, welcome to Planet America's Situation Room. Why, in your view, has Harvard decided to stand up to the Trump administration's demands, whereas other institutions such as Columbia have been seen to bow to them instead?
Harvard was put in a politically difficult, I believe legally clear, but also morally simple position as such that it was really forced, circumstantially compelled to oppose the Trump overreach. Harvard received a demand letter in which there was a grocery list of demands submitted to the university requesting that the university conduct a viewpoint audit or survey or poll asking staff, faculty, and students, where are you on the political spectrum? No American university can do that. The university was asked to shutter, as in to close, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices across the college campus. The university was also asked to put international students, of which, or I should say, in the Kennedy School, they represent almost 50%, some years over 50% of the school. And the university was asked to put international students under a microscope of suspicion. It's simply unfair, unrealistic, and something no university can do. And the reason why we know this to be true, because as of this day, 200 college presidents signed on to a letter essentially saying we can't agree to a federal takeover.
Professor, do you think any of the demands in that letter were reasonable, or do you think they were entirely untenable from beginning to end?
Well, what I would simply say is, to the extent that the letter asked Harvard to address instances of anti-Semitism or bias or discrimination in any way, shape, fashion, or form, that's what universities should do. That is reasonable. What is not reasonable is to have the federal government micromanage Harvard's efforts to address those challenges or any others.
Why do you think, Professor, the issue of anti-Semitism is being used by the Trump administration as the rationale for what you describe as overreach? What is it about that issue and college campus culture, the protests that we've seen and so on, that makes this so potent?
I believe that the Trump administration is not serious and not sincere in terms of addressing anti-Semitism without mentioning the fact that at Harvard we have an anti-Semitism task force, but also an anti-Islamophobia task force. The Trump administration has not addressed anti-Semitism in the context of hate and bigotry all across the country. I don't believe the Trump administration is sincere and serious about addressing anti-Semitism. Why? Because it has focused on that issue without asking serious, thoughtful questions about what is Harvard doing, how is it doing it, and having conversations with students, faculty, and staff as to progress on that issue. And so it is my concern and my fear that the Trump administration is essentially weaponizing the issue. So in other words, if you look at the events of October 7th, there was certainly an uprise and protests around the country. There were incidents on college campuses that were distressing. But to use the sincere concerns and fears and apprehensions that people have around anti-Semitism in a way that allows you to advance a political agenda is not fair, it's not right. And I think he's using the issue simply because it allows him to, unfortunately, engage in a campaign of dividing and conquering.
Professor, how do you respond to those people who say, this is nothing new? Administrations have been threatening universities with their funding for decades to enforce their policies. Barron and Biden did it with their gender and harassment policies as well, and this will keep on happening while governments have control over university funding.
Well, that suggests that somehow that what we're going through in this moment is a matter of a difference of degree as opposed to a difference in the character of the change, the policy. And I would argue this is a difference in both the degree and the character. Here's what I mean. Under the Biden administration, under previous administrations, you have not seen the tax-exempt status of universities threatened. You have not seen a multi-billion-dollar fine imposed on a university. You have not seen efforts to essentially destabilize and to defund universities on a scale that would change the character of higher education. That's altogether different. And so, in other words, in a global marketplace of knowledge and ideas, where we have an American president essentially trying to carry out a trade war in higher education. So in other words, to isolate America, to isolate its colleges and universities, that has a tremendous impact on higher education here, but also around the world.
Professor Brooks, so good to get your insights. Thank you for taking the time for us.
It's great to be with you.
Last week, we brought you the story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a 29-year-old man born in El Salvador who arrived undetected and illegally in the United States as a 16-year-old. In 2019, Garcia, who's now married with 3 children and works in the construction industry, was arrested on suspicion of membership of a gang known as MS-13, which he denies. While he wasn't ever charged with any crime, he was undocumented. While in custody, he applied for asylum. Instead, he was granted a withholding of removal order because a court found of a well-grounded fear of persecution by a different gang in El Salvador. Despite that order, without any further hearings or due process, on March 15th this year, Garcia was deported to a prison in El Salvador by the Trump administration as a result of what it since admits was an administrative error. The Trump administration has designated MS-13 a terrorist organisation, and membership of the gang could be grounds for deportation following a hearing. But while no court has ruled, the president has no doubt. On Friday, Trump posted an alleged photograph of Garcia's left hand, and he claimed
he's got MS-13 tattooed on his knuckles.
But a closer inspection of that image clearly shows the M, S, 1 and 3 across the knuckles has been added in Photoshop. The 4 symbols on his fingers, a marijuana leaf, a smiley face, a crucifix and a skull, may or may not represent MS-13. Some gang members certainly are a lot more blatant in their tats, literally writing MS-13 on their face and neck. Similarly, the Chicago Bulls cap that Garcia was wearing when he was first arrested in 2019 may or may not have been a coded reference to MS-13's use of the devil horn and other hand signals, bullhorn signals as well as tattoos. It's the kind of thing that prosecutors in a trial would have to prove. But no trial, no need. Courts have ruled that the Trump administration should facilitate Garcia's return to the United States, but as we saw last week, that has been basically ignored. Criminal contempt charges may be on their way against Trump's lawyers. We'll see.
Just to be clear, I don't think the person who put MS-13 on that photo of Garcia's knuckles was actually trying to fool anyone. It was a pretty bodgy effort if they were. I think it was just an explanation for the code that you described. Trump may have completely misunderstood that photo, though, when he tweeted it out.
Yes, he certainly misrepresented it. This was certainly a part of an ongoing campaign, though, Chaz.
It certainly was. They basically tried to destroy Garcia's reputation, with Attorney General Pam Bondi saying that he was
one of the top MS-13 members who is illegally in our country and a terrorist.
Wow, he got himself one hell of a promotion there. And then they released Abrego Garcia's entire police file, including the domestic violence complaint that his wife made against him in 2021, where she said, "I have multiple photos/videos of how violent he can be and all the bruises he has left me." By the way, his wife now says about those allegations that things didn't escalate and I decided not to follow through with the civil court process. We were able to work through this situation privately as a family, including by going to counselling. No one's perfect and no marriage is perfect. Also, the DOJ publicised suspicions by a Tennessee Highway Patrol officer that Abrego Garcia may have engaged in human trafficking back in 2022 after they found him transporting 8 passengers who had no luggage. His wife in that case said Kilmar worked in construction and sometimes transported groups of workers between job sites. And administration allies ramped up that rhetoric to the point where they were even implying that those arguing for Garcia's return were themselves committing a crime.
There's one line that divides us. Do you love America or do you hate America? It's really quite that simple. And we have people who love America, like the president, like his cabinet, like the directors of his agencies, who want to protect Americans. And then there is the other side that is on the side of the cartel members, on the side of the illegal aliens, on the side of the terrorists. And you have to ask yourself, are they technically aiding and abetting them? Because aiding and abetting criminals and terrorists is a crime in federal statute.
Maybe those aiders and abettors include the Founding Fathers, because they're the ones who came up with the Fifth Amendment, guaranteeing everyone in the country that they wouldn't be deprived of life, liberty or property without due process of law. Honestly, John, I don't know why Trump's so hell-bent on avoiding basic due process. Last night, Trump tweeted that we cannot give everyone a trial because to do so would take, without exaggeration, 200 years, he says, without exaggeration. We would need hundreds of thousands of trials. But, John, there are only 700 immigration judges right now, and in the first 9 months of this fiscal year, they cleared 460,000 cases just themselves. Doubling that number of judges would cost a little over $1 billion. I reckon the Constitution might be worth it.
Yeah, maybe he assumes that all court cases go for as long as his criminal trial did. Meanwhile, Senator Chris Van Hollen of the state of Maryland, where Garcia was living before his deportation, was among several Democrats to travel to El Salvador to see Garcia last week. After initially being refused access, a meeting was arranged at a hotel away from the prison. When he arrived back in the States, Van Hollen was then arguing that this is essentially about preserving constitutional rights, which, of course, are also extended to people who were in the US illegally.
We need to bring Mr. Abrego Garcia home to protect his constitutional rights to due process.
So this is about more than just one man. Van Hollen, though, is arguing that Garcia has been traumatised by his experience in that mega prison.
And that news might seem to contradict a photo that was tweeted out by El Salvador President Bukele, who tweeted about Abrego Garcia not being in death camps or torture racks, but sipping margaritas with Senator Van Hollen in tropical paradise. But Senator Van Hollen had another side to that story.
As we were talking, one of the government people came over and deposited two other glasses on the table with ice and I don't know if it was salt or sugar around the top, but they look like margaritas. And let me just be very clear, neither of us touched the drinks that were in front of us.
And Van Hollen did have some evidence. The frosting on the lip of the glasses is unbroken, as you can see, so no one has drunk from those glasses. Also, for those criticising Van Hollen for travelling to El Salvador for a photo shoot, a few people have, well, 7 Republicans also travelled to El Salvador to check out that prison, including Jason Smith posing in front of a bunch of prisoners, and this doofus, Rep. Riley Moore, who seems to think he's the Fonz John. Breaking. Politicians like publicity.
Yeah, but they didn't get a margarita. How sad for them. This week, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the Trump administration to pause any plans to deport another group of Venezuelan men who are currently in North Texas, throwing into doubt Trump's mass deportation plans and his use of the 1798 Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah, look, this Supreme Court ruling was actually a pretty big deal, so I'll just take a minute here if you don't mind. If you recall, the Supreme Court handed down a very clear ruling back on April 7 that stated detainees must receive notice before being removed, and that notice had to allow them a reasonable time to actually seek relief in court before they were removed. Well, to give detainees their notice, the administration handed these Spanish-speaking migrants a sheet of paper in English telling them that they'd be deported either today or tomorrow in the shadows of the Easter weekend to Venezuela. That was their notice. And by the way, they're actually going to El Salvador, so that wasn't even true. Pretty dodgy too. And the Supreme Court seems to have reacted. Not only did the court not wait for either the district court or the appeals court to rule before they came in over the top, or in fact, even wait for the government to present their case, but the court also didn't employ any of the delicate, nuanced language of previous rulings. This time, they just said, the government is directed not to remove any member of the putative class of detainees from the United States until further order of this court. Bang, stop it, that's it. But here's the real kicker. The government was actually promising not to deport anyone. A Justice Department lawyer had said in another court that they were not aware of any current plans for deportations on Saturday. And DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin explicitly promised they would comply with the Supreme Court's April 7 ruling. So that was 2 different government representatives promising the Supreme Court that there was no rush. And John, the Supreme Court did not believe them. They rushed their slapdown out at 1 a.m. So maybe what we're seeing now is the Supreme Court losing their faith and patience in this government. And maybe that Supreme Court versus Trump standoff that we've been dreading for months now is just about here.
Yeah, it's beginning to feel that way, that is for sure. But now to a funny little story out of the state of Wisconsin.
The Supreme Court upheld a controversial veto from Governor Tony Evers extending public school funding for 400 years.
Like the federal government in Washington, D.C., states, including Wisconsin, have a state legislature which has the power of the purse strings. They appropriate money, including the state budget. And then, like the president, state governors typically have the power to use their veto to block any bill they don't agree with. And 44 states even give their governor a line-item veto so they can specifically excise a measure from the broader bill. In Wisconsin, a court has ruled the governor can even remove individual numbers and punctuation.
The court ruled in a 4-3 decision that the governor can cross out certain numbers in the state budget.
Now, the Republican-controlled Wisconsin legislature passed a budget 2 years ago, and deep on page 158, relating to funding for education, it said, for the limit for the 2023-24 school year and the 2024-25 school year, add $325. They're talking about the amount that school districts can raise through property taxes for each student. Well, Wisconsin's governor, Tony Evers, a Democrat, announced at the time that he would use his partial veto powers to make a few edits.
I have also used my broad veto authority to provide school districts with predictable long-term increases for the foreseeable future.
True to his word, Evers deleted the and 24 school year and the 20 - and school year, leaving the words for the limit for 2023 to 24-25 at $325, meaning the measure would hold as law until the actual year 2425, 4 centuries from now. Now, look, his point really wasn't about extending this for 400 years, with inflation presumably $325 will not be worth very much by then. But he wanted school funding locked in for more than just 2 years. And when it went to court, the Liberal majority said it was legal.
The Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that Evers didn't overstep his authority. Justice Jill Karofsky wrote in part, "Our Constitution does not limit the governor's partial veto power based on how much or how little the partial veto changes policy, even when that change is considerable."
Now, we should point out, Chaz, that Republican governors have used this partial veto power in the past, possibly never quite to this extent, and we will see now if this opens up a whole new can of worms.
Yeah, if you're wondering how exactly this is even possible, this so-called partial veto power started with a 1930 constitutional amendment. At the time, state lawmakers routinely added multiple different policy items into the one bill, so the idea was to allow the governor more power to reject items one by one. But then some creative legal types, as they do, realised they could eliminate words and letters to completely change the intent of the legislation. So, for example, in 1975, Democratic Governor Patrick Lucey struck the word "not" from the phrase "not less than" to reverse the bill's entire meaning. In the 1980s, Republican Governor Tommy Thompson used his partial veto 290 times, crossing out individual letters to create entirely new words. And in 2005, Democratic Governor Jim Doyle struck all but 20 words from a 752-word passage to create a new sentence bearing no resemblance at all to the original bill. After the Tommy Thompson farce, Wisconsin moved to outlaw what they called Vanna White vetoes, named after the Wheel of Fortune letter turner. In 1990, they passed a constitutional amendment declaring that the governor may not create a new word by rejecting individual letters in the words of the original bill. And then, after Jim Doyle in 2008, they extended that constitutional ban to not being allowed to create a new sentence by combining parts of 2 or more sentences. Okay, so no crossing out letters to form new words, no merged sentences. How is this Evers thing legal then? Well, those amendments didn't explicitly ban crossing out individual numbers. So that's how in 2017, Republican Governor Scott Walker, who's on my t-shirt today, changed December 31, 2018 to December 3018 by eliminating that 1,2. That was known as the 1,000-year veto, and the court allowed that to stand, possibly because the lawsuit had not been brought in a timely manner, though. Until now, when the Democratic majority has now held that the plain language of the constitutional text still permits striking numbers written out with digits. Got to spell out those numbers, apparently, John. So, look, this is a bipartisan battle that's been fought in Wisconsin for decades. I'm sure they'll settle it soon enough. But when Liberals are tearing their hair out about the Trump administration's abuse of the law, not sure it's a great idea for Wisconsin Democrats to be too triumphant about this victory. I mean, imagine how they'd react if Trump tried to pull something like that off. Yes, it's funny. Very funny, but maybe it's a little ill-advised.
Maybe, or maybe Governor Evers, he's a wily old dog, he's thinking, I'm going to draw attention to this loophole and then we'll close it before somebody else can use it. We'll see. That's it for another trip to Planet America. Next week marks Trump's first 100 days in office. Elon Musk is heading for the exit. Others about to follow.
We'll see you right here in the Situation Room at 9 p.m. next Wednesday night. No weekend edition on Friday due to the Anzac Day public holiday, of course. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.